did it's a simple smoke simulation in Houdini and rendered it in sort of a flat lighting, so we can use it in multiple different kind of situations and let's say lighting conditions. When you want to create this sort of layer that you want to use as an element as part of your composition, you want to avoid super strong directional lights or very harsh contrasts in this case smoke. So we would want to avoid having like a let's say a directional light that's heavily skewed in one direction, because if we keep things flat, this would allow us the greatest flexibility in order to blend it in any lighting conditions that we have with the rest of our comp. So from this render here, we have to map this to a card, sort of like we did earlier. So let's reset our timeline. We can also see here that our timeline is now going from 1001 to 1450. And this is because this sequence is up until this 1450 frame and we are using the global here. So if we were to switch this to input, now our timeline is mapped to 1050 and 1450, which is the input of our footage that we are previewing. And when we set this back to global, now we have this up until 1450. Now let's go ahead and press S, and for our frame range here, let's set this to 1240, which is the range of our original render, and our global timeline will now match this 1001 to 1240 frame range. We also see that since this footage starts from 1050, in this case we have to offset this animation slightly, so we can do a time offset. And if I want to push this 50 frames forward, we can set the time offset here to -50. So now if we go over at 1001 and play the animation, we should have this playing. And now also with this time offset, because we have 400 frames to play with, so from 1050 to 1450 we have 400 frames, and the total length of our final comp is going to be 240 frames. We have around 150 frames that we can offset, so when we duplicate this later and assign it to different cards, we can also do a time offset for the duplicates, and in that way we can create very easily variations between our copies. And we'll see how all of this works in a second. But now from our time offset, let's straight away append a card node over here. So this will hook it up to a card geometry, which we see over here. So now we can just push this into space and we will line this up with our geometry. Let's go ahead and also grab our camera, which we already have over here. I will grab this camera node and let's copy this and let's paste this over here. And we will also, while we are previewing the position of this geometry, we will want to reference our position to points node, which we had set up earlier. So let's go ahead and we can drag this node all the way at the bottom here, and let's actually make some more room. I'll grab all of these nodes and I will just drag them up like so, and maybe drag all of my setup here with the card up as well. So we have our camera, our card, and let's go ahead and preview our position 2 points. So here we have it. If I zoom out, we can see our entire geometry. We can see that our card is pretty small. So now what we can do is just drag this in space and position this. Let's go ahead and increase the uniform scale here. And we can see that this position 2 points is essentially just a point cloud. We can see that it actually intersects with our geometry. So our card geometry actually intersects with all of our points. So for example, if I want to place this behind this rubble over here, I can just roughly estimate where our camera is, or if I want, I can set where it says here default, I can go inside. If I have the camera selected, I can now select this camera 2 over here, and now I will view this position pass through our camera. So this is actually not our render, this is previewing this position pass. So our point cloud, we are previewing this from our camera, which looks exactly like our render. I can also go to the position points node over here and I can play around with the settings. I can make the point size bigger or smaller if I want. So from this camera view over here, I can select my card and I can see directly where I want to place the smoke layer. I might want to bring this up a little bit, and I can also play the animation now slightly, and we can see that everything is working. Maybe I'll make this even bigger. Let's do something like this. We can always adjust this later. So let's say that I'm happy with how this looks. I will drop down a scanline render. Let's point the cam to our camera, and our object / scene will point this to our card. And now from our scanline render, let's press tab, and here we have it. From here, I can basically just do a merge, and if we merge this on our, so I pressed M to drop down a merge, this will be my A layer, and my background layer will be our final comp, or rather our comp so far, so our main chain. I can drop down another dot over here, and this is my setup with the card. Now it's not intersecting anymore with our geometry because we are just plussing this card on a sort of like a 2D image. So this is a 3D card, we are plussing it over a 2D image, and I will show you how we can actually blend this in a second. But first, what I want to see is if this lines up with our camera. I'm just going to select a small region over here over a few frames, and I will hit play, and let's see if this is following the camera. All right, and we can see that this works, so this is fine. I can still go in my card settings over here with double click, and maybe I want to position this a little bit more. I might want to scale this up, maybe bring this up slightly. So this is fine, but again, the problem is that we are no longer obscuring our smoke with the geometry. And what we can do here is we can use the depth map that we used earlier to create a mask and isolate this part of the, in this case, this pile of rubble over here. We can push our depth information far enough until it reaches the rubble, and then use that as a mask to cut out a part of our smoke. So this will only make sense probably as we start to create this mask. Let's go ahead and we'll need another shuffle. And in fact, we will need the same shuffle that we used in our fog over here. So this depth with no AA. So we want the version with anti-aliasing, or rather with the smooth edges. So we can copy this. Let's Control C and Control V to paste this over here. And we will point this back to our original render. Let's point this arrow to this dot, and we can rewire this maybe a little bit. Let's do something like this, and I'll just drag this position points node over here to the left, and with our depth pass over here, we want to use this as a mask. And remember what I said earlier, when we want to use it as a mask, we just need to use the alpha layer. So I will disconnect all of this, and I will just connect our depth over here to our alpha. And for now, let's set this property value here to 1, so we are just focusing on the currently selected node. So from here, if I press A, we have our depth information here, so I can drop down a grade with G. I will set the channels to RGB, or rather to alpha, because we only have the alpha channel now. And again, if I increase the white point, if we remember from earlier, roughly a value of 400 will be our furthest point away from the camera, which is this building here. But we don't really want to spread this range specifically. What we want to do is have a rather narrow range, but we want to offset that range or push that range into Z space. So what I mean by this is, if I were to set this to a lower range, if I were to just use a value of, let's maybe make this fade over 20 units. So I will set the white point here to 20. We can kind of see a little bit over here. Let's maybe make this even smaller. So I will set this maybe, let's do 5 instead. And now we no longer see this. If I want to push this entire gradient along our values, I can use the offset adjustment instead. So if I want to push this further, I can decrease the offset value. And if I decrease this enough, we can start to see, as I push these values, we can sort of see how this gradient that's over 5 units. So if we imagine this white to black value is spanned across 5 units in 3D space, we are just pushing this value into this Z space. So farther so further away from our camera until we sort of isolate the rubble, or rather the pile of rubbles that we are interested in, which is going to be this one over here. So we can see now that we finally reached our rubble, and this is exactly the mask that we want to cut out our smoke. So what I can do now is, if I go back to the scan line render and let's press A to get out of the alpha view, we can drop down a gray node and we can point the mask to our channel that we created over here. So I will point the mask to our grade over here that points to our shuffle, and if I lower the gain, we can see now we are getting the reverse of what we want. If I were to preview this from our final result, we can see now that we are kind of keeping the smoke that's in front of the rubble, and we want the reverse effect of this. So if I go to the gray node, I can set this option here for the mask. I can check invert. So now we are getting the correct result. We can also see that we are left with this dark shadow, and this is because we are affecting only the RGB channels. So if we go to this gray node and press A, we still have the alpha information for the smoke that's in front of the rubble. So we want this grade adjustment to also affect the alpha as well. So we will so in this case, we will set this channels to RGBA. So now if I press A, we also have this alpha, and finally, if we preview the result, we have this now nicely integrated with our render, and it really looks like it's behind our rubble over here, even though it's just a random 3D card placed in the 3D system. So this is with and without our grade adjustment, and now we can still go back to our card. We can make this maybe slightly bigger, and now our mask adjustment will persist through our 3D changes, which is really great. And if we want to further control this transition more, we can increase the spread of our ramp here a little bit. So if I were to increase the white point, we can see how this changes. So maybe I want a little bit more interaction with our rubble. We can change the offset. We can bring this slightly forward, and I think in this case it's actually working out pretty nicely. We can play around with the gamma as well, so we can see how much control we can get with this technique, and really how flexible this is. Now from here we can still do some grading adjustments. So if I drop down another grade node, maybe I want to lower the gain a little bit. We'll probably revisit all of these settings later as we add all of our, or rather the rest of our elements, and then we'll start from the top and work our way down to the bottom. So we'll start back with our sky and our fog and readjust all of the elements. One final thing that I might want to show you here is if I just preview this channel, or rather the smoke layer in isolation, we have alpha channel. So when we preview the final result, if I were to drop down another grade node, and this is something that I usually like to do, this grade node I can set to only affect our alpha. And if I want this smoke to be less opaque, because we are using this merge operation, which is set to over, the way this is blended with our compositing will depend on the alpha. So if I have this gray node set to alpha and I reduce the gamma, we can see how we can sort of start to make the smoke more transparent, but only around the edges. So as I decrease the gamma, we are keeping some of this opaqueness in the center of our smoke, but we are reducing it towards the edges. So this is something that you can play around with meaning a grade node set to alpha. Feel free to experiment with this. So usually I have a grade node that's just set to alpha and one other grade node affecting only the RGB values. So I can make this overall darker, and with our second grade node I can affect the transparency directly. So really between all of these techniques you get a lot of flexibility and a lot of options. Let's maybe make some more room here. So this is the setup, and now we can just copy this setup very easily. So what we have to do from here is I can grab all of these nodes, including the merge. I will press Alt-C to duplicate all of them, and all we have to do here really is connect, or rather reconnect, the shuffle to our render. Let's maybe make some more room, and let's bring all of these layers down below like so. Bring this up. So now this shuffle over here should point to our main render. So I can just grab this node and just point this to our other dot where we have this connection. So we should have exactly the same setup. I can merge this on top of our result. And now with our second smoke copy over here. Let's maybe reset the timeline. Let's also change the time offset here. So I might want to push this maybe 50 frames more than our previous one. So I'll set this to negative 100, just so we are in a different part of the animation for the duplicate, and this will help us with variation, and very easily we can add more detail this way. So now I can grab the card and let's preview the card, and let's also preview our position to points pass. So with this card selected, let's make sure that I'm selecting the right one. All right, and let's make sure that we are previewing more properties since we are dealing with 3D. So I'll set this value here to 5. Let's preview the card, double click the position to points, and let's go back to our card so we can now position this in a new spot. Again, we will try to sort of match where our rubble is essentially. Let's do something like this, and I will disable the grade, all of these gray nodes, and just focus on the positioning for now. So if I preview the merge result, it's over here, which is looking pretty good. Maybe we can bring this over, we can play around with the scale, make this bigger or smaller, but this is fine. I might want to introduce a little bit of variation on the Y as well. I might want to just rotate this plane, not so much. Let's undo this. Let's try to set the values here directly. Let's use -5 and just maybe rotate the plane, maybe -20 on the Y should be good. Introduce a little bit of variation in the rotation as well. And now what we have to do with our grade here for our depth mask is find the right offset. So I will try to push this further until we isolate this rubble over here. So I will just increase the offset until we get the rubble that we are interested in, which is over here at this value, so around 9 units. And now I can re-enable all of our mask adjustments. Let's preview this and let's preview the RGB. And here we have it. Maybe in this case, I will want to brighten this smoke overall. I might want to go back to our mask. Let's set this back to 1. So I might want to play around with the offset. Let's maybe just isolate this entirely from the rubble. All right, so here we have it, and we can preview some frames here as well and see what we get. So I would say this is looking pretty good. It's fairly believable. I might want to isolate more of our rubble for this first layer of smoke that we have here. So this is the part where you just go back and forth between the settings and you readjust things until you are satisfied with the results. So maybe I will just decrease the offset here and just place this more behind our rubble instead of what we had earlier. And one other thing that we can do here, we can see if we look at just our smoke render, it's really flat on the ground. I might want to fade this off towards the edges, just to help us blend it more with the environment. And we can use a radial for this. So if I drop down a radial, we will try to match it with the resolution of our smoke. So in fact, what I will do is I will select this reed here with the smoke, and then I will drop down a radial, and now this will place the radial exactly in the center. So I can now grab this gizmo here for the radial, and while holding down Control, I will just scale this up like so. Maybe scale this even more, and I will use this gradient to fade off the smoke layer itself. So now I can disconnect it from our render, and from our render I will drop down a multiply, or rather a merge node, which I will set to multiply, and I will point the radial back at our smoke so we have the same resolution on both of our smoke and the radial. So now if I were to enable and disable this, we can see this is the result that we get, and I can maybe decrease the softness and I can increase the area. I can maybe mask things out a little bit more. So with this extra layer, we might have a smoother result where it intersects with the actual ground. So if we take a look at our result from over here, I might want to increase the brightness of this smoke. But essentially, if we look at this result with and without our radial adjustment, we can see it's more nicely blended with our environment. So in fact, we will want to copy this setup for all of our cards as well. So I will just grab all of these nodes. Let's copy them and let's replace this render from our time offset over here. All right, so now our second radial as well, or rather our second smoke element as well, will have this smooth fade or on the ground intersection. So again, here as well, if I were to enable and disable this, in this case for our second layer, it doesn't really make much of a difference, but it's still something nice to do with your elements. And let's do one more and place this behind this rubble as well. So again, we just have to copy this entire setup, grab all of these nodes, Alt C. Let's connect, or rather reconnect our nodes. And whenever you have a connection that has to like sort of travel a big distance, if you want to make a forward connection, so if you want to connect this node over here to this node, you can select the first node that you want to connect, hold down Shift, select the second node, and then if you press Shift Y, it's going to draw this forward connection between the two dots. So now we can see this is connected and everything still works. So this is our duplicate. Let's go ahead and disable all of our gray nodes, and let's grab our card and let's just place this forward. I'll press W to go in my move gizmo. I know it should be somewhere around this part. Of course, we can now set this value for properties here to 5, and let's also select our position to points, pass, select back our card, press W, and let's see where our rubble should be. This should be really somewhere in front over here. I will probably have to scale this as well. Let's grab our uniform scale, drop this down, place this down below, and somewhere around this place should be okay. Let's preview this from our render. We will merge this in our chain. Let's go ahead and preview this, and from over here I can say that this should be offset a little bit on the X direction. And also for this time offset, let's push this out even more, maybe to 25 frames more, just to maintain that variation. And now we can enable our gray nodes again, and we will need to find the right offset. And let's go ahead and set this back to 1. And for our gray node pointing to our depth, we will want to bring in the offset until we isolate this rubble right in front, somewhere around this place, I would say. So now if we preview the result, we have our third copy over here. We can go to the gray node, we can make some further adjustments, and also on our alpha as well. Maybe I'll drop down the gamma, overall make this a little bit more transparent. And let's go ahead and preview some frames with our third copy as well. All right, so I am pretty happy with this. All of our elements are nicely integrated with our 3D scene, and this is where we have combined our 3D system with the utility layers, and hopefully you can see how everything is coming together. And now you have a small idea on some of the things that are possible and the flexibility that you have in compositing. And really here I'm just scratching the surface. You can really go pretty insane with some of these adjustments. You can really build an entire world and tell any story that you want through compositing. So this will be good for now. Let's go ahead and grab all of these nodes and let's organize things. Grab all of these and place them down below. So all of this here will become, let's draw a background, and this is going to be our, let's just simply keep this as smoke, and let's maybe choose another color here and desaturate this, darken this. So this will be our setup with the smoke, and adding just a few of these smoke layers can really help make your scene come alive, especially with environments. Whenever you add a subtle thing that's changing over time, it's really going to help you break up that static sort of feeling. So if we were to compare this with our original render, if we just look at this, even in isolation of all of the color adjustment that we did, if we look at this and then we compare this with our smoke on top, we can really start to sort of get a feeling that this is an environment that's actually alive. So it's always worth adding a little bit of movement, whether you are breaking up the fog or you are adding certain elements like these smoke layers. It's always worth going this extra step to improve your shots, whether you are working in CG or with real life footage. This is something that you will encounter over and over. And with the next lesson, we can take a look into how we can create our own layers directly in Nuke to contribute to this coming alive of the environment feeling. So I will see you there. So for the next layer, we will want to create a very thin, sort of wispy kind of smoke that goes over the ground, specifically over the entire ground. And we can use all of the techniques that we know so far. We will create a plane, which we will place on top of our ground in a 3D system. And then we are going to mask out parts of our geometry based on their height. So first of all, let's start off with a noise. So I will drop down a noise and make sure that this is the version that has this draw in between brackets. So when we preview this, we've used this before, so or rather I've briefly showed you this when we were breaking up the fog. But this noise layer is essentially just a pattern which we can control and further refine to suit our needs. So we can see we can increase the size here, we can play around with the linearity, gain, gamma, and so forth. So this noise is really helpful. I use it in pretty much every comp that I have ever done. You always want just a little bit of detail, or you want to break up certain parts of your geometry or your other layers. So this is extremely useful in this breakup type of situation. But in this case, we want to use this to create our own sort of stock footage, so to say, that will become this kind of wispy smoke. Now, here previously, we have used an actual rendered file. So I've created this in Houdini. You could have also used maybe a live action plate of this kind of smoke animation. Now, whenever you have the option, you should always use pre-rendered elements or filmed elements, because obviously that will give you the most realistic results. But in some cases, you can just simply fake some of these layers directly inside of Nuke if you combine some of these noises with distortions and so on. And this is what I want to show you with this layer, how we can leverage the simple noise texture to create this kind of wispy smoke on our ground. So first of all, since I want to use this as more of a texture, I want to make this a square format. So if I do a reformat node over here and I set this output format, usually I like to use either 2K or 4K for this kind of situation. So in this case, 2K will be just fine. Let's choose here square 2K, and I connect the noise to this reformat. The noise will now be mapped on this 2000 by 2000 grid, which will be kind of like the way a texture is mapped. So now if I use this on a card, we can drop down a card geometry from here. We want to rotate this so it's flat on the ground. So I will grab the rotation gizmo here with E, and I will just turn this around. We want to use here a value of -90, and we want to animate this noise so it goes across the ground from left to right. And if we go to the noise properties here in the transform tab, we can see which of these parameters we want to animate. So if I were to increase the translate on the X, let's maybe take a look closer. Now it's kind of hard to tell because we keep flickering this texture as we are previewing the changes. So the way that we can animate values inside of Nuke is we can add keyframes. So if I wanted to animate this translate X value, I can go to the beginning of the timeline. I can right click and set a keyframe. This will now show up on our timeline here. If I zoom in real close, let's maybe zoom in here, we can see that there's this blue underscore kind of thing, and this indicates that there is a we have set a keyframe. And now I can go to the end of our timeline at 1240 and I can increase this value. And if you have already a keyframe set, whenever you make changes to that value, it will automatically add a new keyframe. So now I can increase this value here and we can see that this will add automatically a new keyframe for us. So now our noise is animated. So we can either animate values through keyframes, but in this case, since I want just a linear animation, I just want to increase this value over time, we can map it to our frame number. So let's go ahead and I'll get rid of the keyframes here. I will set this to no animation. Let's hit yes. And instead of setting keyframes, we can right click and choose add expression. And now I will simply link this to our frame number by typing here frame. And we can see we already have a result. Since we are on frame 1130, this will give us now, this will output 1130. So if I hit OK, we now have this value here. And as I move forward in time, we can see that and by the way, I'm using the left and right arrow keys to move back or forward a few frames. So we can see that as I move forward, this value now increases. So if I were to zoom in here and just simulate, or rather play the timeline and cache a few frames, we can see that this is the animation that we now get. So if we want to have this animation move faster, we can go back in our expression here. We can right click, choose edit expression. And if I want to make this twice as fast, I can do multiply 2. So now we essentially doubled the speed. I can hit OK. I can preview this now, and we can see that this is now the animation. And also we are animating the noise in the correct way because, like I said, we want to move from left to right. Let's place this now in our 3D scene so we can better judge what changes we need to make. So let's grab our camera, and also we can grab this scanline render as well. Let's copy this and let's paste this over here, and I will connect the OBJ to our card. And if we go through look through our scanline, we can't see this because we still need to position this. So let's also preview our position to points node over here. Let's preview this and let's change the properties here to 5 so we can preview multiple nodes. And if I go now to our card, we can see now that we have to bring this card way further back. So with W, I will move this card. Let's increase the uniform scale by quite a lot. And we want to cover at least the closest part of the ground, so the closest to our camera. So let's move this over here. Let's increase the size. We'll do something like this. So now this should probably look a lot closer to what we need. We can also maybe drag this up slightly. I do want it to intersect with our ground a little bit. This will help us to integrate our smoke more. And if I were to merge this from here on our existing chain so far, so I'll just drop down a merge and just put this over with an over operation. Let's go ahead and preview this, and here we can now see our smoke. So we are almost there. We still need to increase the size of our card, so let's go ahead and let's make this even bigger. Let's make this really big so it covers some of this part over here towards the that's further away essentially from our camera. I might want to push this further out even, but we can kind of start to get a feeling of what this will look like. And if I were to, let's preview some, let's cache up some frames so we can also have an idea on how fast the smoke is moving since we have this noise animated. All right, so I'm pretty happy with this. I think we will keep this speed as it is. And one more thing that we can do for our noise, we can also evolve this noise over time. So if we go in the noise tab, this Z property over here, we also want to animate this over time. We can see how our pattern changes when we increase this Z value. So here we will do right click, add expression, and we want to map this to our frame value as well. So we will do frame. Only in this case, if I leave this at the frame value, we can see that the animation will be really fast, and we want to really lower this value. We want to multiply it or rather scale it down by quite a big factor. So let's right click, edit expression, and let's multiply this. Let's say that we want only 10% of this or maybe even less. Let's do 0.05 and let's see how this speed will look. And probably this is still even too much. We can also right click and choose edit expression, or we can select the value and press equal sign, which will bring up this expression window. Let's do 0.01 instead. Probably this is even still moving too fast, but actually I think this is a lot better. So if I preview this from our merged result over here, let's cache a few frames. So now we have this result. It's looking pretty good. We might want to make this evolved speed even faster. Let's go ahead, go back to our expression window. Let's do our final value here, 0.02. So this should be fine. Now let's see if there's a way in which we can make our noise look a little bit more thin and a little bit more wispy. I'm essentially looking for kind of like sharp lines in between our pattern. So if we go to our our noise, there's different types of noise that we can use, and let's use turbulence instead, which we see now that it's a different kind of pattern, and this will provide for us these thin wispy lines which we want, but we want these lines to be white and the background to be black, so we want to reverse this. So after this noise we can drop down an invert node, and let's make sure that this invert is going after the noise. So let's reconnect this. So we have our reformat, our noise, and then the invert, which gives us this result. And now from here we can go back to our noise, and we will reduce the linearity a bit. If we reduce the octaves, this will make our noise overall smoother. So in this case we do want a smoother result. Let's maybe use octaves 4. Let's drop down the gain as well. Maybe let's increase the gamma. In this case we can kind of start to see our lines, and after this invert we can simply drop down a grade and we can control our smoke this way. So now we are really starting to see the pattern that we are after. We can even reduce the gain here on this grade node, and maybe this is still, we are getting too much detail. We can go to our noise and we can reduce the octaves maybe to a value of 2. So I think this is a lot better. Let's reduce the gain. Maybe the gain will overall help us decrease some of the level of detail, and probably the gamma is looking all right. Let's see how this looks from our rendered view. All right, so this is a lot better. This is exactly what I'm looking for, these thin wispy lines. But now I might want to overall increase the pattern of this noise. So in our noise settings I will go to the size here and just increase this. Let's maybe make this an overall bigger pattern, so something like this. And maybe I don't want this gamma to be this low. I might want to push out the gamma and maybe just overall decrease the gain. Now I'm not gonna spend too much time adjusting these values. I'll leave this up to you because I don't really want to waste too much time fine-tuning settings here. But one final thing that we can do with this noise pattern, so we have this. Let's actually preview this from our grade node. So we have this pattern so far. We can now combine this with other noises. So if I do another noise pattern here, let's use draw. Let's also format this to our 2K view. So we have the same noise that we started with. Now here we want to use this to multiply our existing results. So we can combine these two layers of noises now. I can drop down a merge node here and I can multiply our second noise. Let's set the merge operation to multiply, and we can see, let's maybe reverse the order so we can toggle off the A layer. And we can see with this extra noise layer on top, we introduce even more detail. So for this second layer of noise, let's maybe just increase the gamma, and also I want this to be smoother, so I will decrease the linearity. Maybe the size is pretty alright. I might want to try to overall just make this more smooth. Maybe let's increase the size slightly, and we also want to animate this, but just on the Z I think will be fine. So let's go ahead and press equals here, and let's do frame multiply. Let's use the same value, 0.02, which should be a smooth enough animation for us. And if we preview now our texture from over here with this additional layer of noise, we get something like this. So that's pretty cool, and we can preview this now from our actual comp, and this is what we end up with. Alright, so I think this actually works pretty well. I might want to decrease the speed, but again, I will leave this up to you to decide what kind of values you want to use. I'm pretty happy with this result, and we can see how easy it is to create our own elements, even if we don't have access to, like I said, stock footage or pre-rendered elements. You always want to use pre-rendered elements if you have any, but sometimes, or maybe as a proof of concept, you want to see if something like this could work, and then you can send it to the simulation department and ask them to create an actual simulation of this kind of wispy smoke type of movement. So obviously something like this would look a lot better if it was simulated in Houdini, but depending on how much emphasis a certain element has, you might not need all of that detail and realism. We can see that when we combine this with our other elements, this works just fine, at least as far as I can tell. Now, to make this even more believable, we will have to integrate it with our actual environment render. And in a similar way to how we merged our smoke footage by using the depth as a mask, we can use the world position as a mask in this case, because we want our gradient to go from bottom towards top instead of from front to back. So I'll show you what I mean by this. We've covered the position pass a little bit when we were using it to create our position to points layer over here. So this is only possible through our world position. Let's go ahead and we'll need a new shuffle that points to our render, and actually we can just grab one of these shuffle nodes from over here. Let's copy this and let's paste this down below, and again we will want to point this back to our render. We can go, we might want to add another dot over here. So this dot points all the way to our environment render. So from here I can just grab this node or rather dot, and I can hold down shift and select my shuffle and then press shift Y to create this forward connection. So now in our shuffle we want to shuffle. So here we will want to use our P pass. So this is the world position. When we select this, we have a similar thing here. We can see that we have sort of like the normal pass. We have X, Y, and Z coordinates. So in this case, we are interested in the height. We want to create a gradient on the height, which means that we want to use the Y value over here. If we wanted a gradient that goes across from left to right across our geometry, we would use the X, and on the other axis we can use the Z, but in this case we want to use the Y for the height, so we can plug this in our alpha channel. And if I press A, we can already see a little bit of this gradient. So if I drop down a grade node and I use the alpha channel over here, I can increase the white point if I wanted to increase this gradient. So if I want to increase the spread, essentially, we can increase this. So we can assume that if one of these buildings has in units a height of, we can actually check if we were to go to our shuffle version over here. If we look at this pixel value here, we can sample this. We see that it's 65, so this is 65 units. And if I were to go to our grade node and set the white point here to 65, we will essentially spread out this gradient across our entire building. But we don't want to have a gradient that's really this spread out. We want to tighten this up, so we want to use maybe from 0 to 1. We want a very sharp gradient like this, and we will use the offset like we did earlier to determine exactly which parts of our ground we want to isolate. So in fact, in this case, I can even lower the white point even more, just so I can filter out some of these pieces of rubble over here, and I can decide exactly how I want to blend in our smoke layer. So from our gray node here, we can go to our scan line, and let's preview the RGB, and let's go ahead and do the same thing that we did earlier. We can drop down a grade node from here. We can point the mask to our other grade node that's linked to our position pass, and now I will just set the gain value here to 0, and I want to run this over RGBA channels as well. And now here we have it. We have successfully masked this smoke layer with the height of our geometry. So if I were to disable this layer, we can see very easily we can create this blend between our element that we created directly in Nuke and our actual rendered geometry. So this is really, really cool. And again, we can go back to our grade adjustment here for our position, and I can play around with the gamma. If I want to tighten up this gradient, we can decrease the white point even more, or we can increase this. If I want some of this smoke to spill over the rubbles, I can just increase the white point, as we can see here. But in this case, I want to pretty much obscure it by our piles. So overall, this is just another example of some of the stuff you can do. And here we took it an extra step further by creating our own layer, which we didn't have to import from an already existing footage of the smoke. We created it ourselves with the noise. And again, we are really just scratching the possibilities here. And in time, as you experiment more yourself and as you watch more courses and tutorials, you will have more ideas on how you can combine passes and how you can create your own layers. So this will come naturally in time as you use Nuke more and more. So let's maybe just cache a few frames with this as well and see what we get. But overall, I can say that I'm pretty happy with it. It's pretty believable. Again, for this type of shot, our main element is actually our character So we are not, the eye will not really focus on the specific ground fog layer that we created. So it will only register as something that's going on in the background, and it will just help us create more depth to our scene. So with our elements, with our smoke elements, we added depth from front to back. And in this way, we are creating depth from bottom to top. But we are more or less done with this extra new layer. So we can go ahead and also do a backdrop here. Let's make this bigger. We can name this one ground smoke or something like this. Let's make this darker. And more or less, we are pretty much done with the environment. And with the next lesson, we can start working more on our character. So I will see you there. Now, for the character, we'll take a closer look at what we can do with our passes over here, so with our shuffled setup. But first, I would like to add one more layer of the same smoke element that we used in the environment in front of our character as well. So we want to integrate this with the character. Let's go ahead and I want to show you a new node, which is going to be the postage stamp node. So essentially what a postage stamp is, it's just a connection to another to a different node in your chain. So for example, if I were to place down a postage stamp node and connect this to our smoke layer over here, so to our read node, we can see this postage stamp will create a thumbnail of what it's pointing to. So it's really just a bridge between these two nodes. It doesn't really do anything. It just holds whatever layer you are pointing towards. And this is great because, for example, if I wanted to change this smoke asset now, so if I want to replace this render, let's go ahead and let's maybe just replace this with our character render. We can see that our postage stamp changes as well. And this is particularly useful when you want to duplicate elements or you want to create sort of like a connection. And this is also helpful when you want to keep things organized, where you don't really want to rewire and bypass an entire kind of chain or rather network. So essentially with a postage stamp node, now we can, let's go ahead and undo this so we can point back to our render. With this node over here, I can replace all of our read nodes with our other smoke elements, which is essentially the same render. So I can just rewire all of these other nodes to point to the postage stamp, and I can get rid of this read node over here. So now we can see that we have the same result. If I look at this result over here, we have the same smoke asset. And again, this is great because now, again, if I wanted to change this render, so let's say that maybe, for example, I want to experiment with different kinds of smoke assets. Maybe I have different version of this render. I would just have to replace this single read node over here. And if I just replace this real quick with the character so you can see this, we can see that our other duplicate changed as well. And if I look at the result now, this doesn't make any sense, but now they are both pointing to the same render, which is what we want. So again, I will undo this so we go back to the smoke. And if I want to hide any wire connection for any node, we can go over to the tab over here, and there is this option where we can hide input. So now when I click off of this node, this wire will only show if we select the node, which is really helpful to keep things organized. And you can do this with any node. For example, in this shuffle node, I can go to the node tab over here, hide input. So now when I click off of it, we hide the wire. So again, this is strictly an organizational technique. We can also use the hotkey Alt H. So I will use this from now on when I want to hide a wire. So this is Alt H. We can see it turns on and off this option. So with our postage stamp node, let's replace our third read node as well. So it's all pointing to the same render. I will press Alt C on this postage stamp. We'll bring this down below over here. And again, if I want to create a forward connection, I want to connect my render to this new postage stamp. I will select the render and I will shift select the postage stamp. Let's press Shift Y and we create this forward connection. And now we have this hide input turned on. So when I click off of it, we no longer see the wire. And now I can rewire this render to our poster stamp, and if we preview the result, we have all of our nodes, and we can very easily just change this single read node and it will update throughout the chain as well. So now with this being done, I want to add another smoke layer in front of the character. So again, I can drop down a postage stamp. Let's grab our initial read node over here, Shift select the poster stamp, and then press Shift Y to create a connection, Alt H to hide the wiring, and here we have it. So we can essentially merge this on top. I drop down a merge with M. We can place this over here. And first of all, we would have to format this in this case. So in this particular case, we no longer need to place this on a 2D card in the 3D system. This will work just fine if we just merge this on top, because this is super close to the camera and the camera is orbiting rather slowly. This won't really make much of a difference if we just leave it as a sort of static render on top of our image or place it on a 3D card. It's not gonna move that much. So in this case, we are just going to leave this as it is, not use a 3D system at all. But from here, we see that our resolution doesn't match. So we will have to do a reformat first of all. And let's do a transform node, and we can now position this. So from our final result, I will grab the transform, and while selecting this gizmo, we can see that we can move this around. I can increase the scale here. Let's maybe increase this a little bit. We can do something like this. And I don't think we've used this transform node anywhere so far, but this transform node is pretty self-explanatory. You can scale things up and down, you can move them around, you can skew, you can do all of the regular transform rotations. So I'm sure you are used to working with something like this. One thing happens here when we scale this up and we move it around, we can see that we do have this bounce extended on our comp. So now when we merge this over, we are working with this resolution over here, and we want to limit our elements only to the format size that we are actually using. So our root format, which is 1920 by 1080. So if you end up with stuff like this when you merge things over, so this extended kind of bounce, it's always worth adding a crop to your layers, which will limit it exactly to the size that you are using, so the root project format. And this will make sure that these areas over here won't take any more computational power than it needs to. Because, for example, if I were to not have this crop node over here, and let's disable this, and I add a grade node, or I do other operations, and again, let's disable this. So when I do this grade node, this will kind of take into account this extra space here around our image as well. So if you have a lot of elements that are not cropped, this has the potential to slow down your comp. So it's always good to limit the size of your layers to the actual format that you are using. So we can see that right away we have a pretty decent result, but we do want this to interact with our character. So we can grab the depth map of our character to make our smoke interact with the character. So with that being said, we can grab a shuffle node. Let's copy one of these nodes, and we will point this to our render directly. So we don't want the unpromoted version. We will point this to our render, and we'll bring this down. And again, we can just hide the connection of this wire if I press Alt H on this node, and now we will not see it unless we have this selected. So from over here, we have just the depth extra, which is kind of like that unpromoted thing that we've talked initially. And this is simply because I forgot to set up the depth width anti-aliasing in this case for the character, but this will be fine. So if I want to use this, now I mentioned that usually we place this inside the alpha if we want to use it as a mask. So if I press A, here we can see it, but in this case we have to take into account all this black space around our character. So I will place our depth in all of our RGB channels, and I'll explain a little bit more in a second. But now if I drop down a grade node and I keep this at RGB, I can lower the white point to squeeze in the ramp, and I can just push the offset in negative space over here until we should hopefully, and let's make sure that we are not previewing the alpha, so we are in the RGB view over here. So if I push this in the offset value over here, we can see how we can slowly start to isolate the parts of our character. So maybe I want the smoke to ignore everything that's black on our character. So we have this nice interaction. So the problem when we do this as it is so far, if I were to just use this in the alpha channel, I will just show you this real quick. So let's set the grade to work on our alpha. All right, and if I press A, we now have this alpha information. If I were to drop down a grade from our crop over here and do the same thing that we did with our smoke earlier, let's point the mask to our grade and let's set this to RGBA and turn the gain all the way down to 0. We can see what happens. Let's do invert over here. So we have this interaction with our character, but it is cropped only to the alpha of our character as well. And this is because if we just look at our grade information here and press A, this is essentially the map where our smoke will be visible, but we want the smoke to be visible in the entire region around our character. So we need everything that's behind our character essentially to have a full value of 1. So we want this alpha channel to be white. Now the easiest way to do this is if we just use the RGB channels instead. So in the shuffle, I will again, we want to shuffle this in the RGB channels, and in the grade, let's set this to RGB. So if I press A to go into the RGB view, we have the same result. But now what I can do is I can drop down a constant and I can set the RGB values here to 1, and I can set this as the background of my character. So if I press M, let's point the B layer to our grade and then reverse this because we want the constant to be the background, so the B layer. And if I look at the result now, we have exactly what we need. So now we can actually point the mask to our layer. But now that since we are using the RGB channel, so if I press A, we only have the alpha of our depth, and we want to use one of our RGB channels. So in this case, we can just use the red channels. We can see that if I were to inspect the pixel values here, if you look at the bottom of the screen here, so if I were to sample a region, we can see that all of the RG and B channels are the same value. So really here in our grade, we can either use the red, green or blue. Let's just use red, and now we see that we finally have the result that we are after, and we can still go back to our grade node and we can push the offset, and we can see this very nice interaction with our character. So again, we are doing the same thing, and now I'm going to point the merge to this grade node, and if I look at the final result, we can now go back to our grade for the depth adjustment, and we can push the smoke back into our character or have it be more in the back or in the front. So we have this option to control exactly how the smoke interacts with our character. So now it kind of feels like there's a little bit of smoke that's going in front of the character, and some of the smoke is going behind our character. So we have this very nice interaction. The reason that we didn't have to do this background trick over here for our initial smoke is because we had enough information from the environment to avoid this kind of thing. So if we look at some of these alpha masks that we created here, for example, on our first layer, if I press A, we see that most of this background is already filled. So our smoke being over here, we didn't really need to create this kind of flat background for these layers in order for this to work pretty nicely. But for example, over here on our second layer, if I look at our second mask, we can see, if I actually look at the result, we can see that this is actually cropped by the building. So in this case, we would have to do the same trick with the background, but it doesn't really make much of a difference in this case. But if I were to, let's go to the RGB values here, we can see that it really doesn't feel like the smoke is cropped around this building over here, even though actually it is cropped. We can see it. This is what we are merging on top. So we would technically have to do the same kind of trick for all of these layers. So depending on what kind of depth map you have, you might have to do this or you might not. For example, if we had this character render, if we had a depth layer that's including both the character and our environment, we would probably not have to do this kind of trick over here. But since we just have our character, then we have to fill in all of the black space around the character as well. So this will be all right for our smoke layer. Of course, from here, we can still drop down a gray node. We can increase or decrease the gain. We can also drop another gray node for the alpha specifically. So I'll set the channel here to alpha, maybe drop down the gamma, or the gain, make this more transparent. So probably this works a little bit better. We can still go back to our transform and reposition this smoke. And let's maybe just cache a few frames and see if everything is lining up correctly. And by the way, if at any point you have an annoying gizmo like this on your viewer that you want to hide, you can just press Q, and then you can see this turns the overlay to off, and then we can, with Q, we can turn this back on again. So sometimes really helpful when you want to preview things quickly. Let's again just cache a few frames and see what we have. All right, so I'm pretty happy with this. We have this nice interaction of our foreground smoke with the character. So let's just do a backdrop here, and we can call this, let's call this FG for foreground. So FG smoke, let's do this, let's make this another color here, and we are pretty much done with our foreground smoke. And with the next lesson, let's take a look into some of the options that we have to really fine-tune the look of our character. So I will see you there. Going back to our character setup, we can see that if we were to grab a specific AOV, we can do changes for that AOV or for that render pass. But let's say that, for example, in the case for this reflection pass over here, I really want to isolate a certain part of my character. So if I look at my character as it is, I really don't want this the blade of the sword to be as bright. So it would be really handy if somehow from this pass I would drop down a gray node and I can gain this down, but I only want to affect this part of the sword. And this is where the cryptomats come into play. So cryptomat is another kind of utility layer that you can use. So we could go to one of these shuffle nodes and we can kind of see some of these crypto object passes over here, which look something like this. Now, this isn't really how you use cryptomat, so let's go ahead and undo this. For cryptomat, since it's more of a special kind of pass, we will need to drop down a cryptomat node. And with this cryptomat node, we can point this now to our render, and we want to do this before the unpremult. So if we were to preview this, it looks something like this. It's essentially an ID map of our material. So this will depend on how you set up the cryptomats in your render engine. But in this case specifically, I separated the materials. So wherever we have a different material, this will correspond to a different color. And we can see that the blade has a different material, the hilt has a different material, our character has a few materials. And now what we can do with this is, if I want, for example, in our case, we want to isolate the blade of the sword, I can hold down Control and I will click on this sword. Now we can see this blade turns yellow, which means it is selected. And if I press A, we can see that this will now translate to our alpha channel. So I can now go back to our reflection pass over here. Let's go into the RGB view. And if I want, I can drop down a gray node, point the mask to this cryptomat. And if I lower the gain, let's preview the result from over here. When I now lower the gain, we can see that only the blade is affected. We can preview this from our final result maybe. And hopefully this will now show you the power of cryptomats. It's something that you will most likely use in any kind of CG composite that you do. So very, very handy. And let's go back to our cryptomat. And in this case, for the cryptomat, we have to take into account we have to unpremultiply this as well. So if I press A, we can go to the unpremultiply, and this will now get rid of the aliasing, because all of these layers here, which we are working on, are unpremultiplied. So we will have to take this into account. We can see that, for example, in this cryptomat, if I were to turn off this unpremult, we kind of get different grading around our edges. So again, we have to take into account this unpremultiply business. For the cryptomat, we have to specifically unpremultiply this here. So let's maybe first try to organize things a little bit. Let's do something like this so it's a little bit cleaner. So let's go back to our cryptomat and inspect some of our other settings here. So while holding Control, I can select even more parts of our character, and we can see that all of this will merge into a single alpha layer. If I press A, we can, this is currently our option is set to pick or add, but we can remove if I set this to pick or remove. And now with Control, I can deselect objects. And we can also see that as I start to add more objects, we also have them here on our list. So this is how they are separated. This here is essentially our material path. So this is really cool as well. I can even deselect them if I were to just simply remove them from the list. So I can also do this. I can hit clear to get rid of all of the selections. So it's pretty easy to use, not really worth spending too much time here. Let's go ahead and just keep our blade selected, go back to our grade, we can just grade this down and this should be fine. Let's maybe go back to our render, and also maybe I want to lower the intensity of this hilt here as well. Let's take a look at some of our other passes. I might want to use a different kind of mask for this one here, for example, so I can just duplicate the Cryptomatte node with Alt. Let's go ahead and connect this to our render as well. Maybe we'll bring this all the way over here. And with this Cryptomatte, let's clear and let's control click on the hilt. We'll do a grade node for our shuffle. Let's point the mask to our Cryptomatte. So now I can gain this down. We can preview our results now. Let's enable some of these one by one, and I'm pretty happy with this. Let's take a look at this layer specifically. We might want to drop down a grade node here that points to the same sword alpha, and we might want to gain this down. Let's preview this from over here. We might want to lower this a little bit. We can play around with the gamma as well. And our final layer, this looks all right. And now if I preview the result, this is what we have. So if I were to disable all of our grading adjustment with the Cryptomatte, we can see we can make very specific changes. Probably this is too much. I might want to bring back some of this reflection and specularity. I might want to play with the gamma instead rather than the gain. And we can do something like this. We can always come back to this. Essentially what we are doing here is we are just setting up all of our options that we have so that later when we have all of the elements put together, when we have everything set up, we can come back and we can just pick each element and do any changes and adjustments that we need. So this is just a very brief introduction to the Cryptomatte. Super handy. Again, I use this in all of the comps, literally all of the comps, because you will most likely always need to isolate certain parts of your render, and you always want as much flexibility as possible. We have a Cryptomatte on the environment as well. If I drop down a Cryptomatte node, we can see how the elements are separated here. So if I wanted to affect just the ground, I can select the ground and this will create this alpha mesh for us, and we can do specific changes just for the ground. We could use this also to blend in our wispy smoke that's going across the ground. So from here, for example, if I were to drop down a blur node with B and I just blur this a little bit, this would probably be a fairly decent mask for our smoke, but it's probably better to just use the position or rather the world position in that case. But just to give you an example that you can really use this Cryptomatte layer in multiple scenarios. Now, one other thing that's missing here on this blade specifically, this is a very basic material that I set up in Houdini. It's really just a metallic surface with no detail on the surface, and I specifically set it up this way in order to show you a way in which we can add some of this detail ourselves directly in Nuke. So let's do that with the next lesson. I want to show you now a way in which we can add additional detail on our characters. So really on any part of our character, but especially this blade part, which has this very smooth material. We want to add a little bit of dust and scratches, and let's see how we can do that by just using a simple noise. So I want to introduce you to a new node, which is called ST map. And if we look closely, this will take in two inputs here, which is the ST map and the source. Now, really all this ST map is doing, it's going to map a texture to our UV coordinates, but really it doesn't have to be UV coordinates. It can be any kind of coordinates that go from 0 to 1 across the X and the Y value. So let me show you what I mean by this with a very simple example. If I were to drop down a ramp, and let's make this just a straight vertical ramp, I will just offset this first point over here so it's at the top. Let's do something like this, and let's duplicate this, and with our second ramp we want to make an horizontal ramp. So if I were to just make this real quick, I'm just going to adjust this ramp so it's nice and horizontal. Let's do something like this. It doesn't really have to be perfect, but now essentially we can use these as our coordinates. So if I were to plug the ST map, if I were to point this to our ramp, and as a source for now, let's just use a noise textures. So we will use the noise from this draw category over here. Again, it's the same noise pattern that we kept using. Let's point the source to our noise. And when we go to the ST map, let's now set the UV channels. This is the most important option. So the UV channels, let's set this to RGB. And now what happens is it's essentially going to look at the red and green values of this ramp. And this is how our noise will be mapped. But since our ramp only has values, so if we inspect our pixels here, we can see really that we just have this 0 to 1 value across our X dimension. And we also need it on the Y. So from our ramp, I will do a shuffle and I will disconnect everything except the red channel here. So I will disconnect the green and the blue. So now we just have, if we look at the pixel analyzer here, we just have a value that's going across the red channel that's going from 1 to 0 essentially. So now I want on the green channel to introduce our vertical ramp. So I will point this A layer here from the shuffle to our ramp. This is our vertical ramp that we created earlier. And in the shuffle node, let's set the input here to A. So our second row over here. And from the A layer, I will populate this with the RGB channels. And I will grab the red channel. We can grab any of these channels. It doesn't make a difference. But I will grab the red channel in this case and I will place it in our green channel in our outputs. So we have successfully combined our ramps. We have a value that goes from 0 to 1 on the green channel vertically, and we have a value that goes 0 to 1 on horizontally on the red channel. And now when we go to our ST map, we have both the X and Y coordinates and we can see that our noise is mapped properly. Now here for the best results as well, it's better if we use a square texture. So this noise over here, let's drop down a reformat and let's set this to a 2K texture, so square 2K. We'll point the noise to our reformat. So now we have this nice square texture, and it doesn't have to be a noise. We can, for this example, we could use a scratch texture, but just to keep things simple, we can use the noise. And I also want to show you the versatility of this noise layer. So now if we go back to our ST map, we have this noise map to our coordinates. And for example, if I want to grab this ramp, we can clearly see how this works. If I were to adjust this ramp, if I were to squeeze in this value a little bit, we can see now how this changes our ST map. So while I have this ST map previewed, let's go to our ramp and I can show you how our texture gets mapped or rather remapped in real time, and we can do the same with our our vertical ramp. Now as we do this, we can see that the texture is not really tiled, so it's a little bit different from a 3D app. Most 3D applications will tile the texture by default. There's ways that we can kind of force this tiling to occur, but I don't really want to get too advanced on this topic. This is just to demonstrate how this ST map basically works. So obviously, instead of just creating our ST map ourselves as we did over here, we usually bring over the information from our AOVs. So in this case, let's go ahead and get rid of this ramp thing over here, and we'll grab one of our shuffle nodes. Let's copy and paste this, and we will probably want the unpremulted version, so we can point this shuffle all the way here, and let's rewire this and bring this over down below. We'll do something like this. I think we went the long way around. We probably could have done something like this. So maybe this makes more sense. Again, this just points to the unpremulted version of our render. So from this shuffle now, we can bring in, this is going to be called this UV extra. So we can see again the same red and green kind of business. So if we use this as our ST map, again in our ST map, we can see now our noise being mapped over here. Just make sure that the UV channels are pointing to the RGB if in your UV extra. If this ST map was pointing directly to our render, we now have to set the UV channels to look for our layer specifically. So from the other layers here, we can choose UV extra to get the same kind of thing. But I think it's more intuitive and more in line with the way that we've worked so far if we were to point this to our shuffle and we use the RGB channels instead. Because essentially this shuffle outputs an RGB value. So this is why we have to set this here. Now we have a little bit of a weird issue. We can see that in some places, like over here, the noise is working fine, but in some places it's stretched. And this is because really the UVs are messed up. If your model has proper UVs, you won't run into this problem, but in this case, the UV on the sword is not very great, and this is why we have this stretch thing. Now we can kind of fix this a little bit if we modify this UV coordinates. So if I drop down a gray node, I will set this the channels here. I just want to work with our red channel, so I will deselect the green and blue. And now when we make modifications with this gray node, we will only affect the red channels, and this is easier to see if we preview directly from our SD map. So by adjusting the gamma on our red channels, we can see we might be able to sort of squeeze in the texture a little bit to sort of compensate for this stretchiness. And we can do the same thing with another gray node. I will set this to only work on our green channel, and we can again play around with the gamma, so we get so we kind of try to sort of skew the results in our favor. We can also play around with our black point and white point when we do this kind of modifications. We can see that at some point, if we mess things up, we end up with this problem where our texture gets stretched. So maybe in this case we just want to mess around with the gamma. Now, because we are using a noise texture, we can also just go to our noise pattern here, and in the transform we can go to the scale and we can split up the values in width and height in this case. So we can maybe lower the width, and we can see now that we can pretty much also fix it in this way as well. Now let's go back to our noise and we can play around with the size. We can make this a little bit smaller. We can increase the gain and maybe decrease the gamma. Now it's worth just seeing this as our final result. Let's go ahead and try to merge this with our character. Now I'm gonna place this scratch detail over here after all of our combined shuffles. Technically you should place it per each individual shuffle, so when you add a roughness texture, this would affect the specularity and the diffuse in different ways, so you would have to spend a little bit of extra time if you really want to get super specific. But if you want to just have something done fairly quickly, we can just place this after all of our combined shuffles. Now if we were to do a merge from here over our entire character, this is obviously not what we want, and I will set this operation here. Let's set this to screen. So first of all, I want to limit this to just our blade, and we have our Cryptomatte, so we have the alpha mask from our Cryptomatte over here with just our blade, and on our merge node we can just specify this blade mask as our mask. So I'll grab the mask from over here and let's point this to our Cryptomatte. So this takes care of one part of our problem, and the other part is we do want to integrate this texture slightly with our actual render. So a very easy way to do this if we just multiply our result from over here. So our final merged result of the shuffle, let's drop down a merge node on our SD map and we'll point the other layer to our merged result, and let's go ahead over here and set operation to multiply. So now it's going to pick up the colors and the highlights from our render, and it will create for the most part a pretty smooth and seamless result. As we can see over here, if I were to bypass this multiply, this is the result that we get. So with just a few simple tricks and with our SD map, very easily we can create a nice layer of dust and scratches with a simple noise pattern. Obviously this might look better if we were to use an actual dust and scratches texture, which you can find plenty online, but I think it works fairly well with a noise as well. I really like to spam these noise textures throughout all of my comps usually. So if we preview the final result as well, this is with our dust. Now probably this is a little bit too much. We can always just gain things down. Let's add a gray node after the multiply here, and we can just maybe gain this down make this not as obvious. We can still play around with the noise, but I think this is looking pretty fine as it is. So if I were to enable and disable this, very easily we can add this extra detail on our sword, especially since this is pretty close to the camera. We don't really want this very smooth material, kind of looks like a fake CG from the 70s. So this is just an example on how you can use the ST-Map in your workflow. Now really with this ST-Map you can push this in multiple different ways. You don't really just want to use this to add extra details on your renders. You can really do some crazy stuff, and we'll take a look at an example later as well. But for now, let's keep things as they are, and let's maybe start to organize our character setup here. I might want to actually, maybe we can hide this connection from our shuffle here with the UV extras. So I will press Alt H on this dot, and now we no longer see this. And we also, I might want to hide this connection as well, or try to make this at least a little bit cleaner. So this whole thing over here, let's do a backdrop, and this can be our scratches. Let's do scratches sword, and over here the rest of our nodes, maybe make some room. Everything else over here can be our, let's do backdrop, and this will be our beauty recreate or rebuild beauty. So we'll do rebuild beauty, and let's maybe make this darker. And now we can move forward with the next lesson. For the following lessons, we are going to be using some nodes, or rather gizmos, that aren't directly available with the Nuke installation. So these gizmos are created by the community, and we can find them on Nukepedia. So if we go over real quick on Nukepedia, this is it, and here we can see it says right here in the title, over 1000 free tools for Foundry's Nuke, which means that all of these gizmos that we can find here are free. So these are made by the community, and really this is one of the major strengths that Nuke has over maybe a similar compositing tool like Fusion, because some of these nodes are incredibly powerful. Some of these artists that contributed to Nukepedia really created some amazing gizmos, and I will encourage you to go on Nukepedia and check out some of these gizmos. You can check them by categories. We can see here, if we go to downloads, we can choose gizmos, and then we have a bunch of categories here. So most of these are actually really useful because they serve a specific requirement in compositing. So every gizmo that's created here is created essentially out of a necessity. So these are pretty much all of them are extremely useful, which brings us to the next subject here, which is that a few people put a bunch of these nodes together, all of the most useful gizmos from Nukepedia, they put them together, and this is where the Nuke Survival Toolkit comes into play. So this is a free tool that contains all of these free gizmos. When you install this, it will install all of these gizmos automatically, so you don't have to do anything manually, and it really contains a lot of powerful stuff. So over here where we have the toolkit documentation, we can take a look real quick, and we can see in the menu over here there is all of our nodes laid out, and we also have some examples and a very short description on each of these nodes. And we can see that we really have a lot of gizmos, and all of these are extremely useful. So all you have to do really is go to this link, and here we also have an intro and installation video. So I will really recommend installing this. If you plan to do anything in Nuke, you will 100% need this toolkit. So with that being said, we are going to be using some of the nodes that or other gizmos that are available in this toolkit going forward with the next lesson. So go ahead and install this, and I will see you in the next lesson. And now with this lesson, it's finally time to talk about one of my favorite subjects and one of my favorite things to do in compositing, which is adding glow. Now, adding glow can be a fairly simple subject and an easy thing to do, but it can be pretty tricky to do properly and to get it right. So usually we want to add glow on emissive objects, and in our courses and in my work in general, this happens all the time because I always have a magical particle layer somewhere, and that's usually with an emissive material, so it's nice and bright, and it's usually the element which I want to focus on, so it's really a no-brainer to add glow to that layer. And in this case, on our original render here, on our read node, we have an emissive material on the eyes of the character specifically, and on the edge of our blade over here. And this is, we can access the emissive AOV for this specifically. So from our shuffles over here, there is an extra shuffle in the case for our character, which we didn't have in our environment render, which is the direct emission. So we want to bring in this shuffle over here, probably after our foreground smoke. So let's go ahead and instead of creating a big wiring from our render over here, we will use the postage stamp node, which we used earlier. So let's drop down a postage stamp. We'll grab our render, and in this case, we are not really interested in the pre-molting or unpre-molting in the case for glow. So we are just going to grab the render. Let's go ahead and shift select this postage stamp, press Shift Y to create a forward connection, and then press Alt H to hide the wiring. So from here, this is essentially like a new read node, and let's drop down another shuffle, and we want to bring in, let's take a look, we want to bring in our direct emission. So we can see that this is going to be our emissive materials from our character, and technically to actually recreate the beauty pass, we will just have to merge this on top again as a plus operation. So to recreate what we had, we can do a plus over here, and now we also have this emissive AOV. And this is where we want to focus our glow on. Now, the naive approach will be to just add a glow. So this regular glow comes with Nuke by default. So this would be sort of like the default glow, and if we take a look here, we have some options, but let's maybe just increase the size so we can spread this. But we can see that obviously this doesn't really look all that great. If I were to enable and disable this, it's essentially we are just blurring the layer itself and plussing it on top. So this default glow is pretty trash. I will not really recommend you to use this under any circumstances. If I wanted to just spread out or blur out the image to create kind of like glints or something like that, I would just use a blur instead. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get rid of this, and we will use one of our glows from the survival toolkit. So make sure that you have installed the toolkit, and if I do tab, we can do AP glow. And if you've taken any of my other courses before, you will be more than familiar with this node, with this glow. This is a glow that I use all the time. It's my favorite exponential glow, and we can see already just with the default settings we get a really cool result. And if I were to just plus this on top as it is, we already have well, not exactly, but if I were to increase the intensity here, we can start to get some really cool results. The reason that this glow is better is because this is an exponential glow, and with the toolkit we have an expon glow as well. So this is another type of exponential glow made by somebody else, and this is also pretty good as well. Let's maybe increase the size over here, or let's increase the intensity and increase the size. And the difference between these nodes and the regular node is if I were to demonstrate this with a simple ramp, when we do our normal glow, it has this linear fade, but light in real life has an exponential decay to it. So really what we are interested in, if I add a gray node and I increase the gamma, this is the kind of decay that we want. So we don't want a linear decay, we want the objects to be super bright right around their surface, and as the light propagates through the scene, it starts to decay very abruptly. So we are kind of looking for an exponential ramp over here. So if I were to increase the gain, this is more or less what the AP glow will do for us, and this is why it looks so good, and it looks a lot more natural. And again, I will really recommend that you refrain from using the standard new glow, which again is really just a glorified blur that's plussed on top of the layer. Now if we wanted, we could just leave this as it is, and we can see that this looks pretty cool, and this would be sort of the more beginner approach. We could keep it as it is, but I want to show you some ways in which you can just add a little bit more detail, a little bit of layering to this, and how you can get more control and make this slightly more realistic. So let's go ahead and I will disconnect this from now. Let's maybe... And the first thing that I want to do is I want to separate the layers for the eyes and for the sword. So let's go ahead and from my shuffle, let's drop down a crypto matte and let's point the crypto matte to our render. We'll select our sword, or actually we can see that we just have to select this sword glow over here. So I will get rid of the blade selection. So we just want this edge thing over here. And now from my shuffle, let's go ahead and if I want, let's drop down a merge and I want to introduce you to a new operation here, which is in. So if I set this operation to in and I point the B layer to our crypto matte, we can see that our RGB channels, this thing over here will look at our alpha from the crypto matte and it will sort of use it as a mask. So now when we look at our result, we just have the edge of our blade. And we can do the same thing for our... I'm just going to grab all of these nodes, press Alt-C to duplicate. Let's link them up to our render, and over here in our crypto matte, let's clear selection and let's just grab our head in this case. So when we look at our merge here, we just have our eyes. So we have our sword over here and our eyes over here, and we can do some custom things for both of these when we add these back together. So if I drop down a merge and plus these both together, we have from here the same result that we had initially. So when we preview this from the glow, this is what we had. But now essentially I can go over here. So where our sword is, I can drop down a grade node, and if I drop down the gain, I can affect the overall glow of our sword without affecting the eyes as well. So now I can drop down a grade here for the eyes and I can increase the gain. We can see that this direct emission layer is a little bit messed up in how I set it up, because it also brought a little bit of the helmet as well. This is to do with the material assignment is not really correct. So from our shuffle over here where we bring the direct emission, I will drop down a grade and I will just bring the gamma down. So we are just isolating our eyes and we can see the difference with and without. So now our let's go to our AP glow. We are ignoring the part of our helmet. So we have individual control now both for the eyes and the sword, which is great. Let's maybe go to our sword and increase the gain here slightly. But what I want to do is maybe break up the source for the emission for this sword. So meaning that before we run our AP glow on our sword over here, we might want to break this up with a noise texture. I usually want to avoid really large areas where we have this sort of flat color, even though in reality it would work something like this. I kind of want to break it up. I want to add just a little bit of detail, and in this case we can either use the ST map technique that I've shown you earlier, but I think we can just get away by adding a noise layer. So let's drop down a noise over here and let's just simply multiply it with our sword. So I'll set the operation here to multiply, and we can see we have this very nice breakup in our... This affects also the color but also the intensity. So now when we go to our AP glow, we have this really nice variation in our glows. So you always want to think about ways in which you can break up your layer. So with this noise selected, I can reduce the size of the noise and maybe I can increase the gamma. We just want a little bit of this breakup. So I think this is looking fairly good. We can plus this whole thing on top of our comp. And another thing that I usually like to do with this kind of glow layer is I want the actual emissive object to be a fairly desaturated, close to white color. So when we add the glow on top, it will really feel like it's this super hot kind of thing. And let me show you what I mean by this. If from our plus operation over here, I were to drop down a saturation node, let's go ahead and I will set this all the way maybe to 0 or something like this. If I were to merge this with our AP glow and set the operation to plus, if we preview our final result, now this is what we get. And we can see that with this extra layer on top, we can really get more of a feeling of our emissive elements being super hot. And we can see this on the eyes as well. And if we now isolate our glow layer, it looks something like this. So again, this is fairly good. And one more thing that we can do here is we can break up the glow layer itself. So if we think about what would happen in real life is this, because we essentially have a really atmospheric and smoky scene, some of that smoke would break up our glow. So we want to replicate this breakup again with a simple noise pattern. We can just copy this noise that we already have. Let's paste this over here, and we want to multiply this over our AP glow result. So if we do this, let's set this to multiply, we see we get this really cool breakup in our glow. And this is again one of those things that will help us solidify our comp and actually add more depth and layering to our effects. I will also drop down a gray node here and I will push the gamma out. Maybe we don't want this to be as harsh. We want this fairly subtle thing. And for our noise, we can also animate this on the translate Y over here. We'll make this move. And here I will press equals to add an expression. Again, what we did earlier. Let's do frame and let's just leave this at frame and see if the speed is all right. Okay, maybe we can make this faster. Let's do frame multiplied with 2, maybe even more. Let's do multiplies 3. And we also want to go in the noise tab here and add some value on the Z channel here. So here we'll do frame multiply maybe 0.02 and let's see how this progresses. So something like this, I think it's fairly good. You could also, instead of this noise, you could also use one of these smoke elements to break up the glow. But in this case, it might work better with just a simple noise texture that's animated. So if we were to cache a few frames here just on this glow channel, we can take a look. All right, so okay, so I think this looks pretty good. And again, this is one of those subtle things that will help us really bring our shot and make it feel more alive. So if I were to preview this from our final result here, maybe I want to overall increase the glow here in the AP glow settings. Feel free to experiment with some of these values. We can make this more contrasty, or we can flatten this a little bit. Let's maybe increase the persistence, and this will be completely up to you. And also you can see here that the color is blue, and in the final render that you've seen, the color is orange. So we can very easily change this. If we were to go to our shuffle nodes over here, we can drop down a grade after the shuffle, and inside this gain here, we can just reduce the blue channel and increase the red slightly, maybe reduce the blue channel even more until we get exactly the color that we want. We might want to bring the red channel up, and we can see how very easily we can go from blue to orange. And this speed of iteration is again why Nuke is so powerful, and we can just pretty much copy and paste this node over here for our eyes as well. And for our eyes, for example, we can maybe push the reds even more. We can drop down overall the gain here for the eyes, and we can see the amount of control that we have. So I'm pretty happy with this. We can go ahead and call this glow layer done. So we can do a backdrop here as well, and we'll name this one, let's do glow, make this darker, desaturated, and maybe finally I will just maybe increase the intensity even more. We'll do something like this. We'll probably have to come back to this layer as well and readjusting, so it's not worth spending too much time now. Now this is really just the first part of setting up our glow layer, and in the next lesson we can take a look at the second part. So just adding the glow on the emissive objects is only one part of integrating the glow with the scene. The second part is we have to take into account what would happen in a real world scenario. So even in 3D, if we were to have this very bright, super emissive object in our scene, a lot of this light from this emissive material will spill over to the other parts of our render. In this case, we are mostly concerned about the character because our or maybe a little bit would spill onto the ground as well, but the ground is pretty far from this tip of the blade, or rather the edge of the blade. So we are mostly concerned about some of this light reflecting and bouncing on our character as well. Now obviously this would be better done directly in 3D. Usually with the AOVs you can split up the direct emission. You can have the direct emission as a pass that isolates these emissive parts, and then you would have the indirect emission, so the contributions of that emissive material onto the other parts of the render. But in this case, let's say that we don't have this, and in fact we don't. So we want to add this global illumination or glow bounce ourselves, and we can do this by using the relight node. So this is the next node that I want to show you. This is a super powerful node. It has the potential to completely alter a render and give you the most amount of flexibility. So we will place our glow bounce after our scratches for the sword over here. I'll grab these setups and I'll just drag these down below, and let's also drag down our viewer, and let's place down over here a relight node. Now over here we are looking, this will populate with multiple different wirings in a second, but first we will have to specify the color, which is really this should point to our render, and then we'll have this lights, which we'll look in a second. So first of all, let's go with this color. We might want to just bring our render again over here with a poster stamp. So let's drop down a postage stamp. Let's bring our render before the pre-mold, and we will shift select the poster stamp, shift Y, and then Alt H to connect or rather hide the wire. So now this color can point to our render, and in the relight, let's set some settings here. The normal vector should look at our normal pass, so I will set this to N, and our point positions should point to our world position, which is this P layer. And now in our lights, if I were to add a light here, let's drop down a light and let's add this to our lights. In our relight, we currently don't have anything, and I have the properties value here set to 2. Let's maybe set this back to 1. So we currently don't see anything, and now we can see that when we add the lights, we have a new arrow over here showing. If I drag this over, we can see that we are also now requiring a camera. So let's go to one of our camera nodes. Let's grab this one. It's the same camera that we kept using. Let's paste this over here and let's point the cam to our camera. And now we have one more arrow. This is now looking for a material. So if I do tab and type here material, we can apply a basic material. There's also a specular. There are multiple materials that you can use, but the basic material will do just fine. So let's point the material to our material, and now we can kind of see something. If I were to grab the light and I use the translate coordinates here to move this around, we can kind of see how this affects our character, which is super useful. So this works exactly how it would work in 3D. We can just move a light across our scene and it will affect all of the objects that we have in the scene. We have some other settings that we will look to in a second, but essentially now what we can do to preview this in 3D, we can grab another position to points node. Let's point this to our render, and if I were to preview this, let's set the surface point here, we'll set this to P, and our surface normal, let's also set this to N. So now we also bring in the normal information as well, and let's increase this number of properties that we can preview here to 5, because we are working with this 3D view. And essentially now if I wanted to merge multiple objects, multiple 3D objects in the same scene, we can use a scene node. Let's drop this here and I will point this to our position 2 points, and the second one to our lights, and we can also bring in our camera as well. If we wanted to, we can grab this and also bring in our camera, and now we can see that everything is merged. And this basically means that the light that we placed for our relight over here can interact with the objects in our scene. So if I grab the light, I can now just simply move this in 3D space and we can see how it affects our character. Let's grab the light. I'll place this down below. We will want this to be roughly where our sword is. So let's do something like this. Let's I will set the fall off type here. Let's use quadratic, which is going to be this exponential decay that we talked about. So this will give you a more natural or rather more physically accurate result. And we can increase the intensity. We can see this over here. And now if we go to our relight and press tab, we can also see this, how it affects our character. Now we have a small problem here with our sword, but let's not worry about this for now. In our relight, we also want to turn on use alpha to get rid of some of this problem here with our edges. So it's kind of like the pre-mold version. And now with our light, let's maybe just reposition this. We can also play around with the translate direction over here directly. We might want to, I kind of want to skew this a little bit, even though it's not going to line up perfectly with our sword. I kind of don't really want to brighten up the character that much. I will want to move the light a little bit more around. And we are doing here some very creative choices. So you can see now that if I were to look to the 3D scene, our light is really all the way over here and our sword should be emitting light from over here. But this is again one of those advantages of doing this in compositing, that we can do these kind of offsets and sort of try to warp reality in our favor. So let's select back our light, and we can see that from here, if I were to use if I were to bring the light where our sword is, this is more physically accurate, but this looks better, and it will still make it and it will still make our scene feel like this glow is integrated. We can also see what happens if I play around with the Y value. So I might bring this up, I might bring this, let's maybe lower the translate X, and maybe we can, let's actually bring this further out so it's so our character is not as bright, and we can do something like this. We still have to take the sword into account, but we'll worry about this later. Let's for now leave this as it is, and we'll bring this over here, and we want to merge this on top of what we have, and we'll set the operation here to plus. And now we can set the properties here to 1. So this is the result that we have, and if we preview this with the glow, we still need to color correct our relight node. So from over here we can drop down a grade, and we can first of all try to increase the contrast here. If I were to decrease the gamma, let's leave this as it is, because we still have to talk about the material a little bit. So in this basic material, we have a few options here. We can increase the diffuse, we can increase the specularity. So these are kind of self-explanatory. Feel free to play around and see if you get something that works for you. I will set the specular here roughly to 0, and I just want to use mostly the diffuse value here and not so much the specular. Maybe I can bring down the diffuse. We should probably preview this from our final result, and let's go back to our basic material here and maybe increase the diffuse a little bit. And now with our grade node, I can drop down the gamma. Let's do something like this, and we'll add another grade node which we will use to color correct. So I will split up our color wheel here. Let's increase the red channel and decrease the blue channel, so we have our orangey kind of look that we have on our blade. All right, so now this will fit with our blade, and we can see that with this bounce layer on top, now it should really feel like our glow is solidified in our comp. This is overall maybe too much. We can go back to our basic material and drop down the specularity a little bit. Let's go to our grade and maybe decrease the overall brightness. We want something just a little bit more subtle, but we can see even with something subtle, this all of these small detail and all of these levels add up to our final result. So you always want to think how the elements that you are adding, or rather the new elements that you are adding to your comp, you always want to think how these interact with the environment that you already have. So for example, if this character was standing on water or something, we would have some puddles on the ground. We would have to think about how these elements interact with those puddles. So we will need to fake some reflections and maybe refractions as well. And all of these are things that you pick up along the way as you are doing more and more compositing. Now with our relight, we are completely ignoring the sword, and to kind of fake a little bit of this bounce on our sword as well, we can just bring our character render from over here. So after our pre-mult, let's go ahead and from this pre-mult, let's bring a Cryptomatte on our render to isolate the sword, and we'll control click the sword, and now we can do a merge between this Cryptomatte and our render over here. Let's do A to B so we can use the in operation, and we are just going to mask our sword with this Cryptomatte. Let's also drop down a saturation and make this completely black and white, and then we can just merge this with our relight over here and set the operation to plus. So now let's take a look at our grade node and our other grade. So if we look at our final result, we also have a little bit of bounce lighting on our sword. We can still drop down a grade node after the saturation here, and maybe I want to increase this gain here, and this will be up to you to decide how much you want some of this bounce on the sword specifically. And let's take a look one more time. I'm pretty happy with this result, and we can leave this as it is for now. Let's maybe drop down another dot over here, and we'll do a backdrop. So this will be our bounce. Let's call this glow bounce lighting, but let's just leave this as a glow bounce. Let's set this to a darker color. Now this bounce affects our character, but really it should affect the smoke as well, especially since this is a very thin kind of smoke. The light would naturally propagate quite a lot through this thin layer of smoke, and let's look for our foreground smoke over here, and this will be a little bit more simple. We'll just do this with a simple radial. So if I were, let's maybe just make some room over here, I can drop down a radial which I can place over here or across our smoke. So this radial is just a simple circular mask with fading. Let's also drop down a blur node with B, and I will increase the size here to kind of blur this out a lot more, and we can simply use a grade node, and let's point this to our radial here, so the mask, and with this grade node I can now go to the gain here and just make this more orangey around this masked area of our smoke. And now if I were to preview the result, we also have this nice light interaction with our smoke, and we should probably make this a little bit brighter as well. So you can either adjust the gain or the multiply. The gain and the multiply are essentially exactly the same things. So with this multiply on the same grade node, I can just increase the overall brightness of our colors. So let's take a look, and I'm pretty happy with this result. And one final thing that I want to add with our glow, with all of the glow layers and the glow bounce, I want to add a slight flicker to this glow just to introduce even more life to our scene and have this very subtle thing that's not really going to be obvious, but it's something that we can sort of feel. And let's go to our glow over here, and what I want to do is drop down a grade node, and maybe I'll make some more room. I will use this grade node, and I will set this gain all the way. Let's set this to 0. Let's do maybe 0.5, and now I can use this mix value essentially as the strength of this grade node. We can see that if this was 0, this lower gain value will not be taken into account, and as I increase this, we kind of we essentially increase the strength of this gain setting over here. So we can see that as I play around with this mix value, we kind of create the flickering that I'm after. So instead of setting keyframes on this mix, let's go ahead and right click and set or rather add expression here. So in our noise layers, we use the frame value to help us create an expression, and another value that we can use here will be random. So if we type here random, in between parentheses we will have to specify. We can see that if I just leave this as it is, it will already output for us a result, but we will want this random number to change for each frame. So in between parentheses as an argument, we will type here frame, and now if I hit OK, we can take a look. We haven't explored the curve editor or the dope sheet yet, but if I were to look in the curve editor, we can see that it creates this value essentially that goes from, let's maybe see if I can zoom in here. I will hold Alt and middle mouse drag to the right to see exactly what's happening. So each frame we will get a random value between 0 and 1, and as a result this will now create the flickering for us. If I were to just zoom in on our timeline real quick and let's play the animation, we can kind of see this flickering that happens. All right, so if we want to reduce the frequency of this flicker, we will just have to divide our frame number. So if I go back over to the expression, so again I will just highlight the value and press equals. In between parentheses over here I can do frame. If I want to lower the frequency by half, I can just divide this value by 2. So when I do this, we can see that our curve is a little bit more spread out, and this will mean that our flicker is a little bit less intense. And maybe this is what we want. We might want to reduce this even further. Let's do divided by 3. And now we can see we have kind of like a more smoother curve. And let's play the animation. All right, so I'm pretty happy with this. But now since our glow intensity changes, this will affect our bounce as well. So we want to use the same kind of grading adjustment on our other layers too. Now we can just clone this grade node. If I press Alt K, this isn't obvious right away, but if I press Alt E, and this might be turned on by default for you, we can see with Alt E this shows all of the nodes that are linked together, whether through cloning or expressions. But now we are connecting these two grade nodes, so if I do any adjustment on either of these grade nodes, if I were to set the gamma here to a lower value, we can see on this node it changes, but on this node it changed as well. So it's really helpful, especially in this case. Let's set this back to 1. Let's go ahead and link this grade node. Let's link this to our glow bounce over here. So let's do our grading adjustment. So this is basically the intensity. We will place this after our first grade node. I can even maybe rename this, let's do flicker. So we can add a label to any of these nodes in order to stay more organized. So now our glow bounce will also have the same flicker that we have on our main glow layer. So we can see this now over here. So now that we have this glow layer, we pretty much have all of the layers that we need. And with the next lesson, we can go all the way back to the top to the environment, and we can start making some small changes. We can readjust our grade nodes and see where in between all of these layers we can maybe add a few extra details and really fine-tune the overall look of our comp. So I will see you there. So now that we have all the layers that we need, it's simply just a matter of going back and adjusting everything, and now we can take a look into some of these finishing touches that we can add to make everything come together. Now if we go back to our environment all the way over here after we do our pre-mult, one more thing that I want to add on this environment, I want to show you one of the nodes from the Nuke Survival Toolkit installation, which is P-Noise Advanced. So if we type here, let's type noise, and this is the one that we want to use, P-Noise Advanced. Again, you will have to install the Nuke Survival Toolkit to access this node. Let's point the image over here to our, we can point this to the unpremulted version, so we can point this to our render from over here, and with this P-Noise Advanced we can specify the world position pass, and similarly to how an ST map will work by using the coordinate system on the X and Y direction or the red and green channels, this noise gizmo will use the red, green and blue channels to map a noise texture over our world position. So if the position data here, I will set this to P, we can see now that we have this very cool noise texture running across our geometry, and of course this will follow the camera, so it will stick to the geometry. So you can either use the UV, AOV to map certain types of effects, but you can also use the world position, so that's something to keep in mind. Now over here we might want to make this noise slightly bigger. I might want to play around with the increase the gain here. And let's go ahead and just multiply this over our result. And let's do this after, or rather before our pre-mul. So we'll drop down a merge and set the operation here to multiply. And this is what we get. So we can see that we might want to bring up the size of this noise. Let's increase the gamma. We can drop down a grade node and we can increase the gamma in this way. Let's preview with 5. I will set up the final result here. So I will preview this on 5 and we can see that with our extra layer, so we are not really getting the result that we are after. So we are not getting the correct result, and this is because we are modifying the alpha as well, so we don't want to break up the alpha. So with that in mind, let's actually do our p-noise advance before we copy the alpha. So we'll drop the merge over here before our copy and our pre-mult. Let's drag these over maybe to the side and let's do our pre-multiplication over here. So now we finally get the correct result, and we can go back to our grade and let's increase the gamma maybe, or we can play around with the gain. So with this, we just add another extra layer to break up our textures. We can see that this really adds a lot of layering and detail to our environment, and it was super simple to set up. It's essentially we are just mapping a grunge texture over our entire environment. Now again, this is one of those things that you are better off doing directly inside of render, but even if I had this in render, I still occasionally like to use this noise to break up the textures even more, and I think especially for a scene like this, it provides an amazing result. Let's go ahead, maybe I'll just bump up the gamma slightly so it's not as harsh, and we can now go back to some of our other grade nodes. Let's take a look at some of these. Let's see what are the biggest contributors over here. So I might want to lower the reflection of the sky. Let's look one by one. I might want to lower this down even more. Our sun pass. Let's take a look at our other one. All right, maybe I can bump this one up slightly. Preview the final result. Maybe this is too much. Let's bring some of this back. So I'm not gonna spend too much time really trying to finesse all of these values. I will leave this up to you because this process is pretty self-explanatory. I'm just trying to find the right values here. I might want to lower the amount, or rather the thickness of some of these smoke cards. Let's go over here and see which of these needs adjustment. I will drop down the alpha for some of these smoke layers to make them more transparent, and I can make them less bright as well. Let's do something like this. One really cool thing that we can do, especially with foggy scenes like this, and let's take a look at our fog setup as well. I might want to overall lower this even more. I might want to drop down the gain slightly. We can still play around with the grade here that controls how far we are spreading our mask. We can maybe lower this value, or actually I think this should be fine. Now one thing that we can do after we add our sky and our fog, so from over here we can add a bit of diffusion. So if I were to drop down a blur node with B, let's maybe just drop down another dot over here with period, and let's connect the blur to this dot. So what I want to do here is just blur this image out. Maybe let's do something like 300. And now if I merge this on top of the actual result, I can set the mix value to a very low value, and we can see it creates this very nice diffusion, and it kind of helps us to blend all of our elements together, and it adds sort of an extra fill layer. In this case, since this is a very atmospheric, very smoky kind of environment, it kind of helps to bump up that feeling of smoke. So if I were to turn this on and off, we can see what this extra blur layer will do for us. Now we don't really want to exaggerate, and we can still play around with the size of our blur. Maybe we don't need this one with such a high spread. I will leave this value at 100. And let's go back and inspect our merge. So we can see with this extra layer, this really helps to blend a little bit of these edges and the buildings with our sky element in the back, which is really cool. So really helpful, especially if we preview this with our final result. This will introduce even more contrast with our foreground, which is our character, and the background. So a super quick and easy but extremely powerful technique. And furthermore, I will want to introduce maybe even more of this blurriness, but I want to isolate it with this area here, which is essentially the building that's furthest away from our character. So we want to do the same thing. I'll add another blur node, but we want to only affect this area over here. So I will create a radial and let's place this roughly where we want it, around this place. I will go to the first frame of our animation, which is 1001. I'll bring this all the way over here. I will right click over here to set a key on all of these values, which are the coordinates of this radial. And I will go to the ending of my timeline at 1240 and I'll grab the gizmo over here. And while holding down shift, I will just drag this over until it lines up with the furthest building away from our comp. And now we can see that for the most part this will track our building. Let's inspect some other frames as well. So I think this works fairly well. So now from our blur node over here, let's increase the size. Let's do something like this and we'll do a merge, and let's set this B layer to be our radial, and the operation now, if we choose in, this will now be masked by our radial. But over here we might want to drop down another blur node so we can blur out the edges even more. Let's preview some other frames. We will probably have to expand this radial. Let's maybe go to our first keyframe here and just make this overall a little bit bigger like this. Go to the end on 1240 over here and also increase the size here. And maybe I can decrease the blurring so we can see clearly what's happening here. So now I can merge this other new blur layer on top. We can see that we are just isolating the blur over here, and we can drop the mix value. So now the further away we go from our camera, the more of this blurriness kind of camera diffusion we will get. And again, we can just play around with the size of our radial. Maybe I still want to decrease this even more like so, and let's go to the beginning of the timeline and also maybe adjust this over here. And if I go in between, we can see that this kind of tracks for the most part, and this is mostly because we have a very linear camera animation on the orbiting axis. So if we preview this from our final result with our character, again I can press Q to hide our handles on the screen. We can see with this extra layer we introduce even more separation in our background and more separation with the character itself, which is really cool. So here we can let's maybe hold down Control and place all of our layers up, and we'll do a backdrop over here. So this can be a little bit of we can call this here diffusion. So this blurring will help us separate our character, but another thing that we can do to create the separation is also introduce a little bit of color variation. So I can drop down a ramp in this case, and let's hit Q again. I will make this fade from the top, and I will add a gray node and point the mask to our radial. And with this gray node, I just want to introduce a little bit of blue over here, just so we break up a little bit of this black and whiteness that goes across our entire environment. So in our gate node, let's just decrease the red channel and increase the blue slightly. And if this is too much, I will play around with the mix value to maybe lower this. And I really just want to affect mostly the back part of our environment and the sky. So if I were to preview the final result, this is what we get with our adjustment. And this is a pretty nice contrast. I'm specifically doing this to make our orange color pop a little bit more. We really don't have to go to very extreme values over here. Something fairly subtle, again, just to help our oranges pop out more and to break up the desaturated nature of our environment. So something like this will help us. We can take a look more into some of our other layers. Let's check out our ground smoke. I think this is looking pretty good. We can go forward with our character. For the character, I might want to play around with some of our AOV AOVs here. We can see that I'm just turning them on and off. We can see that this one is a big contributor to our shot, and this last layer as well. I might want to reduce the brightness overall of our reflection from the sky, and I might want to increase the reflection here from the side. And I think overall our glow bounce is too strong. I might want to lower this to something like this. And maybe I want to introduce more red in our overall glow. Let's look at we can go to the sword, which is over here on the left, and with our gray node, let's maybe reduce the green channel to get more of this red. And let's take a look at some other frames. All right, so I'm pretty happy with this. Obviously, the more time you spend, the better the final result will be. But these are essentially the techniques that you can use to make any adjustment that you want. Now that we have everything set up, we can go one by one and affect every pass, every light contribution, all of the layers that we created. And we really have the ultimate control this way. And finally, to finish up the comp, we can add some final post-processing effects. And some of these layers that I usually add is, of course, we can add a grain. So we will drop down a grain node, and here for the presets, I like to use the last one, which is a bit more subtle, and we can see that this will break up that perfect CG look. It will kind of help us to replicate what happens in an actual camera. Now, depending on what kind of render you are working on, you might need to adjust the overall strength of this grain, so you can play around. I can maybe drop the intensity on all of the RGB channels here. This is more of an aesthetic choice, adding grain, but usually with a lot of CG renders you do want to add this grain because it also helps to bump up the blacks a little bit, and it will just help us smooth all of our layers together. So speaking of smoothing all of our layers together, we can add a final diffusion before our grain rather. So I can just add a blur node on our main chain over here. We can increase the size, and I can just drop the mix value over here, and we can see what kind of effect this will have. For our final diffusion, we do want to have the strength rather low, and with this final diffusion, this will help us to spread our glow layers, especially it will help them be more spread overall, and again it just helps to blend everything together. Let's look at this with our grain. Now there's really a lot of different effects that you can use. You can do something that's called an RGB split. There's also halation, but we can keep things simple. We can just add a little bit of diffusion and our grain. And finally, from the Nuke Survival toolkit, there's also a AP vignette node, which is really cool, which essentially just fades the corners of our comp. Again, we're trying to imitate what happens with a real physical camera, but in this case it also helps us focus our eye more around this bright part of our character. Now probably this is too much. I can just lower the amount a little bit, and the AP vignette is just something that I usually like to use in my comps. And now finally, to make this more cinematic, we can drop down a crop and we can change the aspect ratio here. Let's do 235 by 1. So now we have this classic film black borders on our comp. And from here, really, we can call this comp finished. And with the next lesson, we can do a final overview on everything we've learned so far. So hopefully you will join me in our final lesson. As our last lesson, let's do one final rundown over the entire comp, and we can start all the way over here with our environment. In fact, we can probably also do a backdrop here, and we can rename this to Rebuild Beauty ENV for environment. Let's maybe change the color as well. We'll do something like this. All right, so we bring in our environment render, we split this up per individual AOV so we can rebuild the beauty and have access to all of the individual contributions that make up our render. and then we add an additional layer of detailing with this P-Noise Advanced Gizmo that we've got from the Nuke Survival Toolkit. Moving forward to the right, we have our sky, which is just a texture that we added on a 3D sphere, and then with our camera we can render this so it matches the alignment with our render. Just a simple gray node to darken this slightly, so this will be the background for our environment. With our depth pass over here, we created a fog layer which we can add on top of our environment. We have some diffusion by simply using a blurred version of the same image and plussing that on top. Over here with this ramp, we just made everything blue on the top part of our comp. Then with 3D cards, we can add some patches or layers of smoke, which we can integrate in our render. We can mask them by the same depth map that we used to create our fog. And here we have our second one and our third one, nicely integrated with our environment, with our 3D objects by using the depth map. On top of this, we add a ground smoke, which we created with the noise that comes with Nuke, which is simply animated and evolved by using expressions. And this smoke is as well masked with, in this case, the world position. We grab the Y value of this world position, we place this in the alpha, and we can do some grading adjustments and use this as a mask in our smoke layer, and this will be as well nicely integrated with our render. Moving down below, we have the beauty rebuild of our character. We've looked into how to use the cryptomats to make specific grade changes to specific objects or materials in our render. On top of this, we added scratches to our sword by using the ST map that uses a noise texture and the UV pass of our render to create this extra layer of dust on top of our sword. Then we have our glow bounce by using the relight node, which is leveraging the normal pass and the position pass of our render with a light, a camera, and a material to create this nice bounce lighting that we get from our glow. So if we move forward, we have our foreground smoke, and then finally our glow, where we use the AP glow, which is an exponential glow that comes with the Nuke Survival Toolkit, and it's probably my favorite node from really all of the nodes that are available with Nuke. Then finally, some very small camera diffusion with blur, AP vignette, and a gray node as our final post-processing effects to complete our render, and then a crop to just give this that cinematic aspect ratio. So this is all I wanted to cover, and with this we can conclude Intro to Nuke. Well done on making it this far. Some of these topics may go maybe slightly above a beginner level, I would say, but I do want you to have a sense of what Nuke is used for in production. So all of this that was covered is really just scratching the surface of what Nuke is capable of. We can see that even though we have quite a big chain over here, this might seem big to you if you are new to Nuke or if you've never used it before, but really on a large scale production, something like this would be just maybe 10% of the entire comp. Some of these scripts are really insanely huge, and again, we are really just scratching the surface. But this is it for now. Thank you for watching so far, and I hope you enjoyed this course. If you want to learn more about Nuke, you can check out some of our other free courses or paid one as well. Usually the renders are included, so you can jump straight into compositing without having to go through the 3D or Houdini part. So go ahead and check out voxsite.com for more courses, and hopefully we will see each other again in a new course.